Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Diana. Nice to meet you.
You were recommended to me by Shantam Seth.
Yes.
I asked him what book would you recommend that I read next, and he said Stephen Batchelor. That he's the one to go to. And when I emailed you about what we could talk about, I said Buddhism without beliefs because that's what you're well known, really well known for. You said it's 25 years old. You've done some other things since then.
Yes. Yes, Buddhism without beliefs was in a way that I think if this was the entertainment industry, you'll call it my breakout book.
Yeah.
It's the book by which I became known outside my niche audience of Buddhists. And from that point on, really, my writing career, as it were, took off as a writing career rather than just something I did to record, translate Buddhist texts and speak to basically my own community.
Mm-hmm.
So that's right. Yeah.
Well, there's something really appealing about it, I think, for folks that are interested in Buddhism, but maybe not wanting to call themselves a Buddhist or necessarily believe in reincarnation. And my son has a piano teacher that wears a big cross around his neck. And he came home the other day and he was like, "What are we, Mom?" I think my piano teacher is Christian, and it was during Yom Kippur, and they were celebrating that in different ways of, we had the day off from school. And he said, "What are we?" And I talked to him about what it means to be atheist or agnostic. And none of it really hit the mark for us of like, I don't know if we're agnostic because we believe in things, we believe in the, the mystery of nature. And I liked your term, agnostic Buddhist. It seemed like maybe a good combination. But what are you? Are you Buddhist? Are you agnostic? Are you skeptic?
Well,
hi, I'm Dr. Diana Hill. Thank you so much for joining me with Your Life in Process. And if you want more, if you're interested in applying these processes to your daily life, join me at my membership, More Life in Process. At More Life in Process, you will get meditations for you to practice at home. You'll get extra bits from the episode that maybe got recorded after the fact. You're going to get PDFs and handouts, things that you can use to apply your daily practice to your life. And I can't wait to see you there. $5 a month, $50 for the year. You can go to yourlifeinprocess.com to sign up.
I'm probably all three, actually, to be quite honest. I was rather hoping, actually, now you mention this, that the term agnostic Buddhism or Buddhist agnosticism might somehow take off.
Yeah, that's good.
People might find that a convenient label by which to somehow identify with. In other words, I'm a Buddhist, but I don't believe all the weird stuff. Or I'm agnostic, but I've also got a spiritual side that resonates quite well with Buddhist values or something like that.
Right.
But actually, over time, it didn't take off. There is no agnostic Buddhist movement as far as I'm aware. And so I kind of moved on too. I kind of realized that agnostic, in a sense, actually doesn't mean a great deal. It basically means that, you don't actually know everything. And to that extent, a believer, a person of faith, is also agnostic. They have faith, they believe, but they don't know that God exists, for example. They believe that God exists, and so they are technically agnostics. So agnostic is a kind of a generic word for the fact that as human beings, we're basically ignorant of most of the things that really matter. So in a way, it ceases to sort of really have such it doesn't serve so well as a handle, as it were. So what I've done in my more recent writing is really to explore the idea of a secular Buddhism. And that term has taken off. And in my book, Confession of a Buddhist Atheist, and then later in my following book, After Buddhism, which are rather thicker books, there I developed the idea of a secular Buddhism, and secular meaning to do with this world. The Latin secular means this age, this time. So secular Buddhism is in a way a Buddhism that's not concerned with what happens after death. It's not really concerned with whether there are other realms of existence or karma or stuff like that. It's concerned with how to live a good life in this world through a set of Buddhist values and practices and philosophy that help us somehow get better to terms with our own inner life, our own psychology, our own states of mind, to work with that through meditation and other disciplines to sort of stabilize and focus our attention, and then to really put our questions, focus them on what is actually going on in our society, on our planet, I think particularly today. In other words, to bring Buddhist values to bear on secular rather than religious concerns. And now we have quite a number of online communities, Secular Buddhist Network and others, that really seem to be growing. It's a small movement, but it's, I think, a label that more and more people find happy to identify with.
Yeah, so I brought your book, Buddhism Without Beliefs,
Yes.
with me to France. And so a lot of walking around the countryside of Bordeaux, listening to Buddhism. I brought two books. I brought that book, and then I brought Why Buddhism is True, which has sort of more kind of like a science angle to Buddhism. And they're actually a nice pairing to listen to together. One is way heady, the Why Buddhism is True, and then we listen to yours, and there's actually there's more soul in your book, which is interesting in terms of talking about secular Buddhism. And one of the things that you have us do, and this could be part of secular Buddhism, is to ask ourselves some questions as part of maybe a meditation practice, but I just took it as a running practice when I'd go on runs. And some of the questions were things like, why am I here? What is this? Who am I? And these could be questions you could just ponder in meditation, but I like pondering on them in the running in the countryside of France. So then I came back and I was like, I want to interview this guy. And I email you and you say, well, I'm in Bordeaux.
Exactly. Yes.
Like all the other Brits. So here's the other thing about this area. All these Brits in Bordeaux. What are you all doing there?
Well, it's not so much in Bordeaux itself.
No, the countryside. Yeah, the countryside.
It's the countryside around it, particularly once you get up the Dordogne Valley.
Yes.
But where I am, although we're about half an hour from Bordeaux, we're not within what is sometimes called the Weetabix belt, where the British people live. There's very few British people in our village, only one other actually.
Okay.
We're too close to the city. The property's too expensive. We inherited ours from my wife's family. That's why we're here.
Well, tell us a little bit about these questions, because it seems like you're asking more questions than answering them these days.
Yes, I think that's what is seriously needed in our world at the moment, is to people to put aside their certainties, whether they be religious certainties or political certainties or some other certainties they have, opinions basically, and open ourselves to the fact that life itself is fundamentally questionable. We don't know what it is ultimately at all. And we can formalize that practice in meditation, as you suggested. We would sit down and in Zen, you'd ask, what is this? But the reason you do that sort of meditation is to accustom yourself to looking at yourself and the world with a more questioning attitude, to not just immediately say, oh, this person said that, that's bad. But to simply notice, for example, that something's running through your mind. Oh, that's interesting. Now, why am I having that thought? Where's that coming from? What's that telling me? To try to sort of shift from always having an opinion about something to always having a question about something, to holding things more tentatively. And I think Buddhist philosophy is somehow embedded really in a sense of the world that is much more tentative than we tend to think. Things are impermanent, for example. Things are contingent, conditional. Things are empty, even. And there's pain in the world. By focusing one's attention more on those kinds of existential qualities, really, being aware of one's own death more, for example, and thereby asking the question, what is this life for? If you don't really have an engagement with your impermanence, your mortality, it's difficult to really get much traction on some of these questions. They lack any urgency. So I would advocate a Buddhism not only without beliefs, but actually with lots of questions and doubts and astonishments and curiosities and wonder and awe and all those things, which tend to not get spoken about much.
Well, there's
Tick,
books
tick.
about
Oh,
more in psychology now. It's become quite the topic
yes.
of research. Awe is a there's a whole field of Dr. Keltner's work around awe. I mean, we want to take awe and then we want to distill it down into, what it is in terms of
Uh-huh.
our psychology. But yeah.
I think that's very good. I mean, what's interesting when we look at psychology today, psychotherapy, we find that it's sharing ideas. We also find in Buddhist groups, in meditation groups, in certain kinds of philosophy and so on. And I think there's an emerging culture happening at the moment that is spread across a lot of these domains. And I think a lot of these terms are coming more and more to the surface. I think a sense of awe and wonder, I keep coming across that.
Mm-hmm.
And well, the question one asks, of course, is why? Why are these terms now somehow gaining people's attention? And I think probably because we find ourselves more and more in a world that's lost a sense of wonder, lost a sense of awe. Our life has become routinized. It's just to do the same thing day after day after day. We don't seem to have the ability to just stop and be and just look and listen. So I think these different spiritual traditions like Buddhism and others give us tools and give us a language in which we can somehow, experience these things and at least think about them and value them in a way we haven't before. And I feel that's important. I think particularly with our great, existential crises of climate change particularly, I think we really do have to sort of stop and ask ourselves, what the hell are we doing on this earth? Not just individually, but as a community, as families, as members of churches, as Democrats, whatever it is. I mean, what are we really doing on this earth? And I feel it is time to stop and really just sort of get in touch with that question, not just in the head, but in my Zen training, when you practice this questioning in a monastery, you put the question in your belly. Not you don't let it stay in your head. Your head is actually a rather poor place to place such a question. It needs a visceral quality to it. And that's something that takes time to develop, but one can through training and daily practice and so on, start to, in a way, reconfigure yourself, reconfigure your interiority in such a way that certain values become more prominent and others perhaps fade away.
Well, it's an interesting paradox because there's a little navel staring that people get concerned about, right? If I'm just staring at my navel and considering awe and wonder, we're not going to get anywhere. And some of your more recent writings have a lot to do actually with ethics to get us somewhere. I was thinking about awe and wonder and how it actually can motivate us to be agents of change in terms of the choices we make on our planet. A couple of weekends ago, there's like a beach cleanup that happens. Families go with their schools and they clean up the beach. And we were walking along the beach, my son and I, and we were behind a lot of other families. So we thought that all the trash had been picked up. There was no trash bags anywhere. There was no bags of chips or things like that. But then when we got really close to the sand and we picked up the sand and looked at it really closely, there was tiny bits of styrofoam, like quarter of an inch big pieces of styrofoam that were everywhere in the sand. Like you could spend an hour on it pulling out styrofoam and maybe get a handful. And I took a picture. We brought it back. My other son was sick. We took it back to him to show him. One of these is a shell. The rest is styrofoam. Which one is it? And that motivates, right? That motivates that sort of awe. It's sort of a unpleasant awe. Sometimes awe can be, awe, Sometimes it can be wonder in a beautiful way, aesthetically beautiful. So we're picking out styrofoam that may motivate us when we make a choice around where we're going to buy our food next. And in your book, The Art of Solitude, so I came home and asked you about this interview. You said that's not current. So I'm like, what's his most current? But we'll talk about what's your most current. It's not even out yet. But the one that's out, The Art of Solitude, you write about collage making. And this is sort of a creative arts practice that you're doing. And I'm curious about, that's another word, awe, wonder, creativity, how creativity plays in all of this for you?
Just to go back to what you said at the very beginning, that if you just sit in meditation and feel a sense of awe, that's not really going to get you anywhere. I agree.
Yeah.
You could become just sort of self-absorbed, cut off, sort of just locked into your own little spiritual bubble. The point of meditation really is precisely, as you also suggested, that we create a foundation in ourselves or open up a space within ourselves in which we can live better. And one of the ways I think in which we fail to live well is because we're so overcrowded inside with opinions and views and attachments and fears and desires and all these things. So you need inner work to kind of just sort of open up the space. It doesn't mean suppressing or denying any of these feelings or ideas or thoughts, but just giving yourself more freedom and flexibility so that when you do encounter a situation like the one you described, looking more carefully at a handful of sand, let's say on the beach, and I'm sure if you brought a magnifying glass or a microscope, you'd probably see many, many, many more tiny little plastic particles as well. And you do need an openness of mind. You could go, oh, this is terrible, we should do something about it. But you could also just sit there and just acknowledge and accept and say, yes, this is the world we are creating. And allow yourself to sit with that and to sort of feel where you start to respond to that on a more gut level rather than just a sense of sort of dislike or anger or rage or something. And that's where the ethics comes in, because it's very easy to, in a sense, feel that sense of rage, perhaps, that companies are able to, put all their waste products in the ocean. But the real challenge is to then, confront the question, well, what do I do now? How do I respond? It's easy for us to say they should have stricter laws against this, that, or the other. But how do I deal with that? Not just as an individual, but also as someone who has responsibility for, say, children. I mean, you just mentioned your children. I mean, these people will be on this planet probably long after we're gone. And this is the world we're creating for them. So, yes, I agree with you. I think it's we need to find more and more moments in the day where we can just stop and look. Thich Nhat Hanh, who you have mentioned, he has lots of practices, like when you hear the phone ring, you let it ring 3 times before you pick it up. Instead of just grabbing it, which is our sort of instinct. We just, the phone rings, you grab it. He says, pause. Breathe in 3 times, out 3 times, then pick up the phone. And it's a very, very simple little, you could almost say a trick. We're tricking our habits, basically, and we're intervening, we're interrupting those patterns, those habit patterns, to create a space where we can respond to what's happening rather than just react to it, which is, I think, one of the big issues of our time, is we live in a culture of reactivity. And what's curious about reactivity is that it is a what's the word? An anagram of the word creativity.
Oh, really?
It's strange.
Yeah.
It's exactly. It's strange. It's exactly the same letter.
It's not fun.
It is odd, and it works very well in this case because we need to move from a life of reactivity to a life of creativity, and creativity is being able to create something that hasn't quite been thought of in that way before.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have to reduce creativity to producing great paintings and this, which it tends to get, the idea of creativity tends to get monopolized by artists and so on. They're the creative people. And they call themselves nowadays, I'm a creative. Well, it's words like that. I think we need to discover that creativity is something we can in this actualize in all parts of our lives, in all the activities we do. It's about, once again, it's about asking the question, why am I not creative? And I think one of the reasons we're not creative is because we're so reactive. We keep just doing the same things again and again and again, the same habits, same patterns, same likes, same dislikes. We're stuck in a kind of hamster wheel of repetition, as it were. So creativity is incredibly important, but strangely, Buddhism and I think very no religions really seem to speak about it much. It's not valued as such. And I was actually listening to something the other day on the radio. No, I was listening to a talk of a painter, actually, a painter. And he was saying the reason the word creativity has not been in use very long in the West is because creation was considered to be the sole preserve of God. So to claim creativity is to claim something divine in a theistic world, in a Christian world, at least traditionally. So we need to find a place for creativity in our contemplative life, in our ethical life, in our life, in our families, wherever it might be, to somehow free ourselves from what holds us back from, having that spontaneity, that joy, to respond, and perhaps to get it completely wrong, but at least to then learn from one's mistakes rather than just doing the safe thing again and again and again and again.
Well, creativity, I could see the link between, blasphemy and not wanting to, but I actually think what makes people shy away from creativity is that it sets you, you stand out in some way.
Mm-hmm.
If you're being creative, you're not just going with the flow of all the fishies, that you're going a different direction, and that is uncomfortable.
Yeah,
for
exactly.
us, right? So, you're an example of that, saying that you are a secular Buddhist. There's a creativity in that means some people won't like it. Some people will say, "What are you doing?" How can you, talk about Buddhism without talking about all these other things? And it puts you at risk.
Yeah.
So we aren't creative because it's often more comfortable to just do what everyone else is doing. But what if what everyone else is doing is headed in the wrong direction?
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at things like this with technology, so my son doesn't have a phone yet. He's 14,
Mm-hmm.
and he's really the only person in his class that doesn't have a phone. And I asked him, well, when is it most challenging for you to not have a phone? And he said that it's when they're waiting, like when the kids are waiting to get picked up from school, or they're downtown and they're waiting for me to come drive and pick them up. It's when they're waiting, because when they're waiting, everyone's on their phone, and he's the only one that doesn't have a phone to turn to. So he's waiting alone while everyone's in their world. And actually that window of waiting is a window that we've lost, and also is a window of potential creativity, because it's in those waiting moments, especially for children, where something creative, they'd come up with some creative game or conversation, or look at something they haven't noticed before. But when you're on your phone, you don't see that. So there is this element of maybe we've lost creativity because we don't want to be uncomfortable and be different, but also there's a loss in the space. We've lost the spaces to be creative.
Yeah.
There's not as much space for waiting or boredom, and the creativity that emerges out of boredom.
I think that's absolutely right. And yeah, you do take a risk when you choose to do something that is different. And to be creative basically means to give birth to something in a way. And something that is born is new. A new possibility is realized that hadn't perhaps been quite realized in that way before. And we know how upset fundamentalist religious people can sometimes be, that if you make a slight deviation from orthodoxy, and I found this certainly in terms of the reception of my own work in my Buddhist community, is that people become very, very uncomfortable. And you are basically very quickly become a sort of pariah. You're someone that is suspect now. You don't really, hold the true faith anymore. And what's also odd, I found, in being non-orthodox in my views, is that you can also start losing people who you thought were your friends. It's friendships are held together very often by, consolidation. Having partners in the same belief system. It makes you feel good, makes you feel safe. So I think creativity is a big ask, because it's asking you to take risks. It's asking you to do something that might be disapproved of, but it's also asking you to be true to yourself. It's asking you to respond authentically and appropriately to the actual conditions in the world. And And I do think this business with the cell phones that you just described with your son, I mean, I think particularly with young people, it's not, adults, everybody does it. They're locked in their phones. And I think it is a taking over of our attention in a way. It's a colonizing our minds with the demands and the attractions and the seductions of what's flickering on the screen. And so here again, I think you see the space that can be opened up, for example, for some people with yoga, with others with meditation, or maybe philosophy or whatever it might be. And I think these spaces are becoming increasingly endangered in our world. Our society is not moving in that direction. And the term you used, going against the stream, is a term the Buddha used. He says, my teaching goes against the stream. It's not going along with the stream. In other words, with just the well-oiled wheels of the world that just trundle along and everybody just follows. But it's actually saying, no, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to move against the stream. And if you think of the metaphor of going against the stream, if you're in a river, which has a stream, let's say you're swimming downstream, to go against the stream, it's suddenly harder work. Swimming upstream, you're also being constantly pushed back. You have to put much more effort in. It's more uncomfortable. You can't just let yourself glide or float. So what this all points to, I think, is if you want to lead a creative life, an ethical life, a contemplative life, you do really need to somehow get to grips with the inner space, you might call it, to somehow gain some ability to be freer within your innermost thoughts and choices. And that, I think, then is to serve as a foundation for then how you relate to the world, how you speak to others, how you work, how you deal with your kids or whatever it is. And it's the constant grounding of that quality of attention that we need to create more and more moments for such kinds of awareness. You don't have to formally meditate. You might, as you mentioned, find you get into that space when you're walking or jogging or swimming. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is the quality of that sort of free flow, open, spacious, alive sense of being who you are. That's what really matters. You can call it many things, but it's very much about that, in my humble opinion.
So part of that is the well-being that comes from being alone with ourselves. And I interviewed a researcher, Erin Westgate, a while back, and I didn't even interview her about this topic, but she's well known for this seminal study where she put people in a room for 15 minutes of thinking time alone. And in the room was also a machine where they could self-administer shocks, just a mild shock, nothing really painful. And 2/3 of the men, rather than sitting alone with their thoughts, shocked themselves. And 1/4 of the women shocked themselves rather than sit alone in a room with their thoughts. There's an interesting gender difference that, again, I didn't ask her about this. I should go back and ask her why is it men are shocking themselves more than women? I don't know. But there's this, being alone with our thoughts for many of us is quite aversive. And yet you wrote a whole book on the art of solitude and why actually being able to be alone with ourselves, whether we're alone with ourselves in that moment when everyone else is on their phone and we're not on our phone, or we're alone with ourselves. I have such a fond early memory of coming home from my school and my mom cooking dinner, and she would tell me to go to the garden and get the tomatoes. And just that afternoon time of going, I'd be in the garden for like 45 minutes, right? It doesn't take that long to pick a tomato, but just the time of being alone with myself after school, after a busy day, and how beneficial that was. It's actually a practice that I do with my kids now, is I send them to take out the compost, or I send them down to the garden, not because I really need them to, because I want them to go out into a space by themselves and take their time. So there's a bit of a paradox there. We don't want to be alone with ourselves. It's uncomfortable being in there. We'd rather shock ourselves than be alone with ourselves or go on our phone. And yet this may be a very important thing to cultivate. Solitude.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, what I was sort of struggling to say before in talking of an open space within ourselves. Essentially, that's that's our solitude. That's our inner solitude. And we're not, as a society, brought up to be comfortable in that inner solitude. We're suspicious of people who seem to spend all their time just alone. There must be something wrong with them. We think, don't you need some company? And sometimes perhaps there is a problem. I mean, loneliness is also a dimension of solitude. And in French and in German, for example, you can't really distinguish in the language between solitude and loneliness. It's the same word. La solitude in French means lone. For most people, usually it means lonely. It's unpleasant. And we're fortunate in a way in English to have a word like solitude, which is somehow kind of emotionally neutral. It doesn't have to be good, doesn't have to be bad, but it's certainly not immediately associated with loneliness, which is, of course, painful. And it's something that many people suffer from in our modern world as well, particularly elderly people. So I feel, which once again, this comes back to the idea of learning how to be friends with ourselves in some ways, learning how to be comfortable, just me alone. But what's also, we discover, strangely, when you spend sustained periods of time alone in silence, for example, is you realize that you're never really alone, because you're always with yourself. You're always you get to be more intimate with yourself, that you are a dialogical person. And we spend a lot of our time, and we notice this as soon as we start meditating, that this voice constantly sort of running a monologue in our heads. And it's running a monologue because we're always talking to an implied other, that we speak because we're listening to what's being said. It's a very odd thing when you look at that dialogical structure of consciousness, that we're always in relationship with ourselves. We're never really alone. And so aloneness, therefore, becomes a space within which we get to know ourselves better. We get to be more in touch with our feelings, as they say, or with maybe emotions or difficult memories that we would normally just try to sort of brush aside. And meditation, though it's often associated with states of peace and joy and all these things, meditation is, for anyone who's practiced it for any length of time, could be pretty scary. Stuff comes up when the mind gets still and when you're in your solitude that kind of hits you out of left field. Memories from childhood, perhaps, or a very uncomfortable conversation you had, which you've been trying to forget, suddenly becomes right there in your meditation. And that is associated with all the physical and emotional feelings that those words or whatever it was then provoke. So we need disciplines. Discipline is too strong a word. We need practices, I think, that enable us to, in a way, live better with ourselves, much in the same way as we need practices to exercise our bodies, to develop social skills and so forth. But our education system doesn't address that. Maybe some schools now might be introducing mindfulness and so on, but it's certainly not a priority. And I remember when I was a little kid, probably 7 or 8 years old, I remember once very, very vividly asking myself, why in these classes on history, geography, English, Latin, French, does no one ever talk about what's actually happening for them? Nobody's talking about what it feels like to be in a classroom. I was very conscious of that at a very young age, and I found it was a weird kind of deliberate ignorance of the thing that really matters most for us, and that is how I feel, who I am, do people like me? That's taboo. We can't address that. But if we don't deal with these feelings, we're not actually receiving an education that is, I think, properly preparing us for the kind of world we live in now. And I would like very much to see, particularly with children, more and more of this kind of self-reflective awareness. Do you find with your kids that they're exposed to this at their school or not?
Yes, both of them, but we've chosen schools very carefully.
Oh, okay.
So we chose our our elementary school based on its social emotional learning, where they'll prioritize that over anything they'll prioritize a conflict on the playground over any math problem that they're dealing with in the day, and use a lot of conflict kind of resolution, compassionate conflict resolution practices. But really, that's why we go to Plum Village in the summer. That week is invaluable education for them, and we see the impact. There's a long tail of impact when they come home for a long time, and it's something that we use in our family. And it's also, I think it's an education that I continue to need to have. Even as you ask that question, nobody ever talks about what it's like to be learning the material in the classroom. In a lot of ways, this podcast is about, also not with you because you're not a therapist, but when I talk to therapists, is like, what's it like to be a therapist in the room with a client? You're not just teaching skills, you're a human that's having an interaction that's impacted by another human. And you take it home and you have your own self-doubt and you don't know what direction to head, or you really care about this person and what's that like. So there's I'm interested in having those types of conversation and kind of pulling back the veil a little bit of what's going on inside. But, as you were talking about solitude, I also think that we can make more of an intentional practice to like go off and be by ourselves. Go away for a few days. Actually, a good friend of mine I was talking to her and she was just coming back. She said, I just went to a hotel for 3 nights because I needed to. It doesn't have to be a retreat even. She's like, I just need to leave everyone behind and go and be in my own space and just be with myself again. Like, what is it? What time do I want to wake up? What do I like? What am I questioning? Because we're moving so quickly and there's so our margins, we used to have papers with margins on them. And now we're looking at everything on a screen where there's no margin. It's just from one thing to the next.
That's right.
I listened to your interview with Krista Tippett, a couple interviews you've done with her.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Really beautiful.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed speaking with her. It was terrific. She's such a good interviewer. Wonderful.
She's so good. But what was interesting is that the one that you did with her was pre-pandemic on Solitude. So I mentioned that we're going to talk about what's coming out next for you. And if you want to hear more about Montaigne and your work around, go listen to the Krista Tippett interview, because we didn't even tap into any of that. And she talks with you more about that, which is part of Art of Solitude. But you like to creatively pair these philosophers with Buddhism. And the next one that you have coming out is about Socrates, which piqued my interest a little bit, because one of the there's a lot of influence of Buddhism in psychology, but there's a huge influence on Socrates has a huge influence, especially on the cognitive behavioral branch of psychology. The Socratic method is one of the things you get trained in as a therapist, of how to ask questions. So there's a thread there too. But tell us what you're interested in now in terms of Socrates and Buddha and how these two relate to each other.
Perhaps the thing that really clicked with this particular project is the recent scholarly work that's been done in Buddhist studies that has led to a redating of the Buddha's life. Traditional Buddhism and even Western scholarship on Buddhism has accepted that the Buddha lived in the 6th century BC, that he was born in about 650, and he died in about 580 or something like that. In other words, in the 6th century BC. And that's been accepted for a long, long time. But recent scholarship has shown that actually there's very compelling evidence, in fact, evidence that has more or less convinced the scholarly community that the Buddha was actually born about 80 years later. He was born around 480 BC, and he died around 400. In other words, he lived in the 5th century BC. Now, for most people, that probably doesn't mean a great deal.
So long ago, what's 80 years?
It was. But what that does is it makes the Buddha suddenly an exact contemporary of Socrates. In other words, Socrates is said to have been born about the Buddha about 480, and Socrates dies, and we know this, this is historical, he dies in 399 BC. In other words, just after 400 BC, which is roughly the date the Buddha died. So it struck me, well, could I then write a book in which I told these two people's lives, as it were, in tandem? Could I use what we know so much more about Socrates than we do about the Buddha? I mean, we have the whole of Plato, we have Xenophon, we have all of we have plays with Socrates appearing. There's a huge amount of material. There's very little material on the life of the historical Buddha. In one of my other books, Confession of a Buddhist Atheist, I spent a lot of time reconstructing what the human Buddha would have, what would he have done? What sort of world did he live in? What can we know about, the course of his life? But by casting that against the much better information we have about Socrates, in a weird way, the Buddha can be somehow reflected off his contemporary in some way. And what I do as a literary device is I imagine myself as a Buddhist in Athens in the 5th century BC. I think perhaps what, in a way, gives them the strongest connection is that both of them were people who, in a way, embodied another way of being human, a way that broke with the traditions of their past, and, I mean, quite radically broke with their respective traditions of the past, and introduced a way of life that was based upon what I am calling an ethics of uncertainty. In other words, neither the Buddha nor Socrates made any absolute truth claims. This is the nature of, in Socrates' case, what is justice, what is love, what is compassion, and so on. He analyzes it, he probes into it, he asks questions, but he never gets to an answer. He comes to rest in what's called an aporia, a kind of basically a suspension, a space, a bit like nirvana in a way, in which you are passionately concerned about living a just life, you're passionately concerned with justice, but at the same time, you don't really know what it is. And the more you look into it, the more mysterious it becomes. But that doesn't diminish your commitment to live according to a life that is just, a life that is fair. And Socrates' life is from what we know of it through Plato and Xenophon, was a modeling of that kind of life, a life that's not based on any metaphysical or religious foundations, the belief in God or the belief in absolute truth or the law of karma or something. And the Buddha, I think, is much the same. He also doesn't, he actually formally rejects answering any metaphysical questions. In the beginning of the world, end of the world, mind and body are same or different. He says, don't go there. That's not relevant. What matters for him, as it mattered for Socrates, was how do I live well? How do I cultivate a way of life that allows myself and others to live more fully, to flourish? And so what I've done in this book is really is try particularly to go deeper into that commonality, into that deep shared ethic that I think that both figures embody, albeit in very different ways, because they're, 5th century BC Athens is not remotely similar to 5th century BC Uttar Pradesh, where the Buddha was. So there are differences, but I think it's been very helpful to me to really use these two figures as a way to get at what lies at the root of human, what Socrates called leading an examined life. The unexamined life, he says, is not worth living. The Buddha would have said the same. And so that's where that book starts off, and then it goes off. Actually, I just printed it. I just made a file today of the first complete draft, and it's 400 pages. It's a big, thick, fat book, and it goes off into all kinds of odd directions as well. But I found it enormously helpful, and I think it could also be useful as a way to somehow, heal some of the divisions in the world, to recognize there is a deep common ground between, the source of Western philosophy and the source of at least the Buddhist philosophies that we find in Asia. And I think to be able to honor that common origin, I think would be something that would bring people together. And it would also, I think, give us the possibility of starting again. what would be the relevance of that insight in dealing with, say, climate change now? That's the only important question for me. So I try to use this ethics of uncertainty as a framework for then addressing the kind of crises, both personal and social and environmental, that we are currently confronted with. And I think a joint venture, as it were, bringing stuff in from the Buddhist traditions, bringing more in from Socratic tradition, as well as the later Greek philosophies, particularly skepticism, Epicureanism, Stoicism. All of this, I think, can work together towards providing us with a framework to perhaps see the world more clearly, but more importantly, to have practices that enable us to respond to the world more creatively, more intelligently, and ultimately more ethically.
So the ethics of uncertainty kind of circles back to where this all began with agnostic Buddhism.
Yes,
and
exactly.
That it's more about asking questions, as Socrates did, or maybe as a good therapist would do, without having the answers, just asking more questions, as well as having the ethics of a desire to be helpful in this world, be helpful to yourself, be helpful to others, and what that looks like, whether it's in climate change or poverty, or your own, just really your own household. What would be most helpful in your own household? And maybe the term, thinking again of like, what are we, Mom? I don't know if we're agnostic Buddhists, because like you, I don't want to just sit in Buddhism. There's all these other traditions that I'm drawn to. I'm drawn to yoga. I'm drawn to, aspects of psychology or ACT that have a spiritual nature to them. I'm drawn to physically nature. I'm sort of the hawks that are outside my office and the little rabbits. Like there's something there that's quite spiritual as well. And I'm looking forward to reading that. It sounds like a big one.
Well, if you want, I'll send you a copy if you like.
Well, yeah, I would have liked a copy before this interview. That would have been helpful.
Well, the trouble is
it
didn't exist before this interview. It's only just been put together.
Yeah, it's just been put together. Yeah.
This morning. But going to your point, though, which I think is actually a very important one, is I think more and more people today feel like you do, probably like I do. I find the spaces between these traditions to be more interesting than the traditions themselves.
Yeah.
It's the bit between Buddhism and Christianity, or between therapy and religion. That's where I find myself interested. And this is a space again. It's an in-between. It's an uncertainty. It's full of possibility. It's not constrained by the doctrines or the beliefs or the practices of Buddhism or therapy or Jung or Freud or whatever it might be. It's a free space. And maybe what we're moving towards globally is actually a kind of a celebrating of the spaces between our cultures, in which we're able to meet each other, and to meet each other in this, with full respect of our differences, but by finding a space that exists between them, a bardo almost. That's what the Tibetan word for the intermediate state is called. It's a space of freedom. It's a space of uncertainty. And I think it's actually, I think, the origin of much creativity.
Right. And a space of multiculturalism, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of when we look at food and the evolution of food, you go to a restaurant and you see all these different cultural influences in one dish that makes it unique to that chef that may have, some roots in Vietnam and some roots in Cuba, and maybe some travels to somewhere else, and they put it all together in something that's unique to them. As we live in a much more multicultural world, the lines between East and West are not really, I don't know where those lines exist
anymore. I don't think those lines are there anymore. It's a hangover from the colonial period, really.
Right.
And it's a very useless distinction. It's hopelessly general, the East, the West. It doesn't mean anything. And I think it's past its sell-by date. I think we need to move on to a genuine multicultural global awareness. It takes us out of our parochial obsessions and our chauvinism and sectarianism and so on. That, I think, is what causes so much suffering in the world.
Well, thank you, Stephen Batchelor.
Thank you
what a
very much,
delight
Diane.
to come across your work, and I look forward to reading more. I'll share lots of information about you for folks who want to read some of the books that we've talked about, and listen to that interview with Krista Tippett, which is, please don't compare.
No.
She's a tall order. She's incredible. And and next time I'm in Bordeaux, I'll
yes, next time you're in
you
Bordeaux, look, we'll probably be here. I'm not going. We'll be here all summer, I think, next year. Yeah. No, just drop us a line, and we'll meet up.
You're on the way to Plum Village.
We're between Bordeaux and Plum Village.
Yeah, exactly.
Halfway.
Yeah.
So
yeah, there you go.
You can drop in, have a cup of tea, and then go on to Plum Village.
Sounds good. Okay.
All right, Diana, it's been lovely talking to you.
You as well.
And I hope this records well and comes out well.
Yeah, so do I.